Book of Mormon has a ton of spirit. I feel the spirit when I read it, and for me personally, I know it is true, and that's what I can give you.
I appreciate your connection spiritually with this book, but do you also can you imagine at least that the personal connection one can have with any book? It could be books of the Hindus, for example. It could be books of the Buddhist texts. Or it could be a book when someone reads the Harry Potter and they have that connection, deep connection, and they feel so much. Because these personal spiritual connections can happen, and people can be led and directed to live their life because they're moved by it. Arises, God is independent and sovereign. He doesn't have to listen to anyone, because that's what independent means. You can act independently. You, as an all-powerful God in heaven, you can act independently, and you want him to annihilate from existence. You should be able to do that. Let's say he becomes non-existent anymore, but you are also all-powerful to remain in existence. Then how did he become non-existent?
So we have the concept of 3 levels of heaven, in which that the way you live on earth determines which level you go into, and it's the highest level who are able to eventually become.
Both of you go into highest level, and then this is what you want.
Sure.
So you have this problem. It's a logical problem. It's a logical problem, and this is an illustration to show you how more than one absolute being is not possible rationally to even imagine, and to ground that possibility, because there will be this conflict of will, and this confusion and ruin will appear. So the very concept that you can become like God, rationally speaking, to me is meaningless in that sense, because you can't be like God, because God is, in that sense, he's totally independent, sovereign king with his will that is command. So if you're going to become like him, you can overthrow God if you want. The God that created you,
I can't hear you.
the God that created you and made you into God, you can just overthrow him and say, that's it. We don't want you anymore. These consequences of this kind of belief is there. So what we say as Muslims is that if you really believe in a concept of God, then there is this automatic consequences. Creator and the created distinction. The creation can never be like God, ever. By definition, they will be limited, they will be finite, they will be dependent. These 3 essential characteristics the creation will have in relation to the creator that created them. The moment you are created here, doesn't matter what happens to you, you are already limited and finite and dependent. The moment because you are dependent once, you're already dependent. You never become independent. Yeah, God, who was independent to begin with, he will always remain independent. Yeah, so that's some of the questions that you can reflect on in terms of if you want to address, that you have something to share with me in terms of how do you solve this problem. Go ahead, listen. If not, I can ask you some other questions about what are your objective evidence that you can share about the truth in Mormonism, in terms of the Book of Mormon, for example. How do we know for sure, objectively, that this is indeed from God, rather than simply, it claims from God?
So
how do you know that any scripture objectively is of God?
You have to search it out for yourself.
You test it.
You have to.
Yeah, that's it.
So what are the falsification tests that you can offer?
The Spirit. One of the core beliefs of our doctrine is that we encourage you to read the Book of Mormon for yourself. It's not on us. You read it for yourself, and at the end, there is a passage of Scripture where it encourages you to pray for yourself and then have the Spirit testify to you if it's true. If the Spirit doesn't come to you, then that's okay. It's not true to you, but I have had a personal witness of the Spirit to me, as I'm sure you've had it with Quran.
Yeah, but that's subjective.
That's
Sure,
not
it is. Yeah, it is subjective.
Yeah. So that's what we're asking for. The question I asked you in the very beginning is, what objective evidence can you share? And objective, not experience, evidence. There's a difference between our personal experience and evidence. So if I were to tell you, like the Quran, as my brother here explained a little bit earlier on, perhaps, in terms of how we can objectively demonstrate the divine origin. So the Book of Mormon, for example, we can read it and it must give us something to either to falsify it or to testify of its truthfulness.
So there have been a bunch of studies done on it, as I'm sure there have the Quran. I'm not saying that the Quran doesn't have truth in it. I think that a ton of the books of Scripture do. I'm not objectifying that. But so in the Book of Mormon, there are evidence. So it was revealed to Joseph Smith, who lived in the Americas in the 1800s and didn't have beyond a 3rd grade level education. However, as studies have been done on it, they found that the tone of writing doesn't change, which is really impossible if it's not, revealed to. There's ancient writing uses such as chiasmus that he would not have known due to his education level at the time. There's also been a little bit of archaeological evidence found, so that's some objective evidence. If that's
what is that as an unique to demonstrate that it cannot be from human being, but can only be from God? This charismatic, this structure you talked about, the linguistic devices that we see, it's quite common in the ancient literature, for example, how even in the Old Testament, and in fact, when we read the Book of Mormon, we see a lot of it's like from the King James Version type things. The language that you find, it's coming from there, from the Old Testament. It doesn't reflect someone like, sometimes when you read something, it gives you the first impression counts. It gives you the impression like, he knows he's talking about, or this author knows what they're talking about. So how can we falsify this book?
It's because it comes from a 17-year-old with a lower than 3rd grade education level in New York, who shouldn't have been able to write that, even if he was, which he wasn't. We've looked at other letters that he's written, and he was not very good at writing, in other words. He could write letters, but he wasn't very lyrical, didn't know all this stuff, but it came forth through him, and to us that shows the...
Now, what is it unique that one cannot write something like the Book of Mormon? Because you can get someone now today and then come up with copying exactly the same kind of linguistic genre that you have in the Book of Mormon, copying from the Old Testament passages from here and there, modifying a little bit here and there, and then produce something like it. I mean, this is what, with all due respect, when someone reads the Book of Mormon, they can automatically link that with, like, this is the Old Testament writings, and this is someone's little bit of changes here and there. But what is so unique that gives you the divine hallmark that this is from God? That's what we're looking at. The Quran has that, but that's the different discussion. But in the Book of Mormon, you need...
Would you like to tell us what the Quran
He explained something already. The Quran, you cannot imitate even a smallest chapter of the Quran because of the linguistic composition that it is. It's the way it's composed.
Yeah.
It is. You can bring the most proficient of Arabic speaker or someone who's learned Arabic language and will not be able to bring within this composition to imitate like it. You know how Shakespeare's sonnet is in terms of how he writes. Same as 14 words in a line, whatever, and so on. There is some objective measure in which we can actually construct this poetry. Quran is not like any of these poetries in Arabic language people know of. It has its own rules. It has its own composition styles called the Quranic stylistics, and it asks you to imitate something like it. The fact that when you're about to imitate something like it, because the Quran has, from, of course, God's speech, the composition makes sense. If you were to use the same stylistics, it simply doesn't make sense. To give you an example, when the Quran says, وَلَا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى, no bearer can bear the burden of another one. It's like, no bearer, yourself, you cannot bear the burden of someone else. You're only responsible for what you can bear. The Arabic language is used like the word wazara, as you just heard. If you were to substitute this same stylistic pattern with another, say, a synonymous word, it simply then cannot work and give you this meaning. It becomes a laughable meaning. Like, no pregnant woman can bear the pregnancy of another. It becomes like this. If you were the word hamila, la hamilatun, something like this, illa himla ukhra. Because the word now, hamila, the word which is a synonym to wazara, to bear, refers to a pregnant woman, because that word denotes a woman who's pregnant. And substituting this kind of pattern within this structure, it becomes a laughable sentence. So this is what throughout every single composition of the Quran, if you were to substitute and put another synonymous word or a verb or so on and so forth, it messes up altogether. But when the Quran introduced it in this form like this, That was the uniqueness of the Quranic eloquence and the composition at that time. That's one of the miraculous challenge of the Quran, to falsify it if it's not from God.
Can I suggest something? Since religion is referring to God and is therefore of a very spiritual nature, how about you read the Book of Mormon and I read the Quran? And then...
I've read bits of the Book of Mormon a long time ago.
Have you read the entire thing?
No.
I'll read the entire Quran.
Yeah, read the entire Quran. But what I'm saying is, I can't, what I'm saying is, you need to give me a good reason to read the entire book, given the amount of outstanding thing that I have for now. I can't subscribe to this kind of task at this very minute. But in principle, I agree with you. It makes sense that I should read full of the book, whole of it, from cover to cover, and you read the same thing. Yeah.
So let's do it.
So when you do it. But I will try when I try to get time in my busy schedules. But in the meantime, would you like to share something about some uniqueness of this book, so that it helps me to give me this prompt to say, you know what, leave all those tasks that you're doing, presentations or whatever that you have to do on Monday, for example. Anything else you'd like to share? Because I can give you something for you to look on about the Quran, to give you like real prompts to say, that's interesting, so let me explore further.
All I can do is give you a witness of the personal nature of it to me, that I know it is true. I've had the Spirit witness to me, and for me personally, it is the way that I believe I can come closest to God. And that is what I have for you. I'm sorry, I'm young, I'm 19, so I don't know very much of the ways of the world or any of that. I don't know how to give you some big speech, but what I do know is that for me, the Book of Mormon has a ton of spirit. I feel the spirit when I read it, and for me personally, I know it is true, and that's what I can give you.
I appreciate your connection spiritually with this book, but do you also, can you imagine at least that the personal connection one can have with any book? It could be books of the Hindus, for example, it could be books of the Buddhist texts, or it could be a book when someone reads the Harry Potter and they have that connection, deep connection, and they feel so much. Because these personal spiritual connections can happen, and people can be led and directed to live their life because they're moved by it. You can read a book, a novel by a particular author, and you say, actually it makes sense, let me live my life as a vegetarian because cruelty to animals, you know what, we don't want to do that anymore. And you change your life and you live accordingly. What we're asking for, something other than that. There is not only a spiritual self, discovery, not only spiritual, you're saying?
You believe that Jesus is the way, right?
No.
No?
Jesus was the way during his time.
Yes.
So was Moses during his time. Every prophet, every messenger was the way during their time. But as their time passed, another prophet came. If it was Mormon Book of Joseph Smith, then it makes sense that he needs to be followed, if he was indeed the prophet of God. If Prophet Muhammad was the prophet of God, and he says there's no other after him, the finality of God's message, finality of prophethood, then you should think, why am I reading another book? If I'm convinced the Quran, God has revealed and said he sealed it, this message is now completed, God's final guidance is given and perfected, you don't need another prophet, another messenger. Then you don't need to seek the Book of Mormon, for example. You don't need to seek anything else. So that is, in principle, the approach one can take. But what I'm saying is, other than the spiritual connection, one thing is the intellectual query and exploration. In terms of, rather than just simply saying, it feels good, it moves me, I feel happy, but something else. Think about it. Is it possible that this could be all?
Can I direct you? So I am 19. I obviously have not done a ton of studies on my own because I am just finished high school. This is what I personally believe. But there have been a lot of studies done. So if you go to BYU, so I come from a college that has done a lot of studies. So if you would like to research that topic more, I recommend you go to BYU and search up BYU BYU.
Which university is that?
Brigham Young University.
Brigham Young University.
So they have done a lot of studies. If you would like to search that up.
Absolutely, no problem with that. Because I have seen already some studies. In fact, some of my friends have done some works on this already, in terms of the very works of Joseph Smith and the people that may have composed it, and the few elders that he had together. So I am exposed to the critical studies already. So further studies is not going to be a problem.
And where can I find the studies on the Quran?
The Quran, what I'm simply asking you to critically examine this book. Why is it not possible? So why is it not possible? Don't worry about it.
Sorry.
It's just an accident. Why is it not possible to imitate this book? Why is this book free from contradictions? How does this book talk about all these things people describe in terms of prophecies or the natural world?
I guess I have one more question for you, referring to something you said earlier. I guess, do you guys have living prophets today?
We have the finality of prophets, because God has told us that He has completed His favor upon us. He has perfected our religion and made Islam as the finality of our religion. So what we need is no other prophets, no other messenger. We just need to follow this message that is there. The foundation of the message is there. We can live and we can seek any solutions to any problems based on this Quran and the teaching of the Prophet, based on his manifestations of the Quran, because he was a walking Quran. So if you bring problems of euthanasia, of abortions, you name it, anything, Islam has that solutions of it. But you have a concept which is different, in which there's a living prophet throughout, isn't it? And you have the same problem then continuously. How do you determine that prophet is a prophet of God? What are the evidence for his prophethood or her prophethood, prophetess, for example? So these things, do you really critically determine someone a prophet of God or not?
So again, that's a very... So in my opinion, because religion deals with God, you have to rely on the Spirit, and that's another one. But thank you for having this debate with me.
If you don't, I hope you don't get offended.
No.
We don't shake hands with...
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, don't be. But that's what it is. And of course, if it was my wife or my mother and sister, that's different. But and you perhaps know the reasons already, because there is always a chance of attraction between the opposite genders. So try to minimize all of this, because don't be, because perhaps you don't know. But that's how Muslims are, and that's one of the things people don't appreciate. Also, like when we have Muslim patients who are like females, women, and the doctors come and start shaking hands, and they feel like, oh, like you're an alien and something like that. Yeah. And they find that there's already a communication gap or something. And I hope people learn more about each of our cultures and our differences between this practices. Even like Jewish women, for example, you'll find that they would not allow someone to shake hands with them and so on. And if you think about it, psychologically, spiritually and so on and so forth, you will see that why should we in the first place? Because if you imagine now, we had a culture in which someone started kissing on their lips as a gesture of like saying goodbye. At this very moment, you will say, oh, that's too much, isn't it? But that's how we feel about shaking hands, because just as you feel about kissing in the lips, there is some kind of significance, physical connection and so on and so forth. Shaking of the hands can also have that kind of significance.
So is there anything else, any other customs I should know when interacting with?
Like this, we for example, we sometimes out of respect, we put our hand on our chest like this, out of respect. That's all, for the opposite gender, to show that the respect to that, it's not, it's not a personal thing. It's just only to say we respect you, we honor you, and that's it. As simple as that. That's what we generally do in many Muslim countries.
Yeah. So you will see Muslim women would not, and Muslim men, for example, would not socialize in clubs and parties and so on and so forth. People have these leaving dues. People have this, during Christmas and other things. Why you will see like, oh, this he says he can't come, he's busy or something. Because we can't be participating in this kind of gatherings for reasons, because there are some restrictions in terms of what is permissible within the boundary of our living and which is not. And for good reasons. If you were to explore it before, why are we going to go and start going into a nightclub and start dancing and mingling with each other? And what does it do in terms of physical purity of one another's thoughts and intentions, because intention is something that we often forget. People think like, it's okay, but when people start hugging with each other in the opposite sexes, there's bound to be something, testosterone is something that is real. For a man, of course. It will come into play. If someone walks naked, you can't expect, for example, someone doesn't even have this kind of, sexual arousal, for example. If it's not, then something wrong with that person. So likewise, the touch, the physical connection and so on, there is always this, even in the biological sense, there is the role of that. There is a role of that. So what Islam does is we leave all of this to within a boundary of that way it can happen. For example, in marriage, it's fine. Or if you're where it's no sexual attraction and so on and so forth. For example, you can shake hands with an elderly woman who has lost any.
No, actually, some scholars they said that actually that's
even that, you see. But there are things where you can. Say for example, if you have someone in your house, a young child maturing, and so on and so forth, there is a whole load of practical consideration and manifestation in terms of how much connection one can have physically and how much not. And I appreciate that you appreciate that. Okay, this is as a sign of our understanding of each other's particular way of life.
Yeah. So, thank you for having this talk with me. Did I do that correctly?
Yeah, that's fine.
That's fine.
Whatever is comfortable with you.
Whatever is comfortable with you. But what's important is, we had that conversation.
Yeah.
And we would consider things further, what is indeed the truth behind us. Because ultimately, the discussion we're having was that because we want to worship God.
Yeah.
We want to connect with God so that we don't end up in hellfire. Do you believe in hellfire?
For the worst of the worst. Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah.
The Christian, yeah?
They're from the Mormon
I
church.
actually have a meeting I gotta go to.
Fine.
I didn't think this would take
That's
as long
fine.
as it did.
No worries.
Thank you.
Okay, you take care.
Take care of yourself.
Yep.
All right.